The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I first ask unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be lifted?
Without objection.
And second, ask unanimous consent that Cristina Diaz-Torres and Elena Elkin, two fellows in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've crossed through and beyond 150 time to wake up speeches, and people sometimes ask me how I come up with the material. It's actually easy, even week after week after week, because it only takes reading the news. If we look back at the headlines and dubious milestones of 2016, we find plenty to talk about. Last year was hot. NASA and NOAA are expected to certify later this month that 2016 was the hottest year in recorded history, exceeding the previous record set by 2015 and the previous record set by 2014. What this means is that 2014, 2015, and 2016 have each succeeded the last as the three hottest years on record. The United Nations World Meteorological Organization found that the world was 1.2 degrees Celsius, or over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer in 2016 than it was before the Industrial Revolution and the dawn of wide-scale fossil fuel use. We are careening closer and closer to the 2 degrees Celsius mark, which scientists say brings, to quote Donald Trump in 2009, catastrophic and irreversible climate effects. In 2016, climate change continued to make some places almost unrecognizable. Up north in the Arctic, things got bizarre. Thermometers spiked in mid-November to almost 35 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal, with a 37-year low in the nearby sea ice. The peaks were about 50 degrees above normal, and around Christmas it actually rose above freezing at the North Pole. Imagine, Mr. President, the snow was actually beginning to melt at the North Pole just as Santa was loading his sleighs with Christmas gifts. In the tropics, undersea forests of once colorful coral stood bone white as the Great Barrier Reef experienced the greatest bleaching and coral die-off on record. What happens is that super warm waters stress the corals. That forces them to expel the tiny algae that live symbiotically with the coral and provide them their food. And that's what gives coral reefs their beautiful color and their life. When the algae go, the coral structures turn ghostly white. They often do not recover. And it's not just the Great Barrier Reef. My clips today included a story from Japan, whose biggest coral reef has just been determined 70% dead. The researchers in Australia found severe bleaching throughout the Great Barrier Reef. The Guardian reported in March that 93% of the 3,000 individual reefs had been touched by bleaching, and almost a quarter had been killed by this bleaching. By November, around two-thirds of the northern portion of the Great Barrier Reef had died, with some atolls suffering complete devastation. Warming is at the heart of that catastrophe. We also know from the physical laws of thermal expansion that as ocean water warms, it does something else. It expands. And the oceans are also taking in melting water from our shrinking glaciers. Together, those factors are causing sea levels to rise worldwide. Last year, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences predicted that our current pace, over 90% of the world's coastal areas, will experience almost 8 inches of sea level rise by 2040. 2040 is not that far away. On the Atlantic coast of the United States, it will be more than 15 inches. By 2040, a house that you bought on the coast today could be literally underwater before you paid off your 30-year mortgage. The real estate business is starting to take notice. Zillow, the online real estate marketplace, has released a tool for users to show how potential sea level rise by 2100 would affect the over 100 million U.S. homes in its database. Around 1 in 50 homes in the United States, or just under 2 million properties, will find their ground floors underwater by 2100 if we don't get ahead of this. 36 U.S. cities would be considered completely lost. That's their words, completely lost. And another 300 cities would lose at least half their homes. And this doesn't even include commercial or public properties. Government-backed mortgage giant Freddie Mac is girding for broad losses from climate-driven flooding. The economic losses and social disruption may happen gradually, it wrote in an April 2016 report, but they're likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. End quote. Let me say that again. The losses are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. Some of the effects of climate change, the report says, may not even be insurable. And unlike our 2008 housing crash, owners of homes that are subsumed by rising seas would have little expectation of their home's values ever returning, and therefore little incentive to continue to make mortgage payments through the crisis. And that, in turn, adds to steeper losses for lenders and insurers. Remember that Donald Trump signed, along with his children, this full-page ad in the New York Times in 2009. Here's what it said. We, speaking as Americans, we must embrace the challenge today to ensure that future generations are left with a safe planet and a strong economy. He said to the president in this advertisement, "We support your effort to ensure meaningful and effective measures to control climate change, an immediate challenge facing the United States and the world today." It went on, "Please don't postpone the Earth. If we fail to act now," it continued, "it is scientifically irrefutable." Let me repeat his words, scientifically irrefutable, that there will be catastrophic and irreversible consequences for humanity and our planet. That's what Donald Trump and his family said in 2009. Catastrophic and irreversible. We have been warned. President-elect Trump also pledged to drain the swamp here in Washington of corporate insiders and special interests. But we don't see that. We see an alligator pack of climate deniers, oil executives, Koch brothers flunkies, nominated to fill his cabinet, his White House, and executive agencies. The Koch brothers and Exxon and other special fossil fuel interests stand on one side. On the other side stand our military, our national labs, NASA. Let me put in a little footnote on NASA. They have a rover driving around on the planet Mars right now. You think their science might be okay? And on the other side also, I think, is every university in the United States of America. That's the choice. The fossil fuel guys, led by the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil, and the whole array of phony baloney front groups that they've stood up to try to mask their hand, and the virtually complete science establishment of the world, every nation, our military, our national labs, and all of our universities. Who are you going to believe? The ones with the huge conflict of interest, or the people who know what they're talking about? Well, too many people in this room have made the wrong choice, but we need to fix it. In Rhode Island, some good things happened last year. After over 8 years of work, we have the nation's first offshore wind farm. 30 megawatts, 5 turbines, came online in December 2016, the Block Island Wind Farm. I'm proud of Deepwater Wind for getting it done. I'm proud of Rhode Island for establishing a process for siting and approval that is now a national model, and it is part of the transformation that happened, emphasized in 2016, and that was jobs in the renewable energy industry taking off. At the end of 2016, we had 400,000 wind and solar jobs. By 2020, that number is expected to be 600,000. And as employment climbs in these industries, costs for renewable technologies continues to drop compared to fossil fuels. So last year, we saw new records for electricity generation from renewable sources. Texas wind generation hit a record 15 gigawatts in December of last year, meeting 45% of the state's power needs, with 18,000 megawatts installed and another 5,000 megawatts under construction. Iowa, Mid-American Power is planning to add 2,000 megawatts of new wind by 2019. Once installed, 85% of the energy Mid-American generates will be renewable. And we continue to make real progress internationally in 2016 as well. Earth Day was the signing ceremony for the historic Paris Climate Agreement. Nearly 200 nations pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. By October, we had met the threshold for ratification of that agreement, with over 55 countries officially joined, and the agreement was fully adopted in November. And just this week, over 630 companies and major investment firms with a combined 1.8 million employees and 1.15 trillion in annual revenue called on President-elect Trump and us in Congress and global leaders to continue to participate in and implement the Paris Agreement to, and I quote them, create jobs and boost U.S. competitiveness. This is the business community saying that the Paris Agreement will create jobs and boost U.S. competitiveness. Signatories included food giants General Mills, Kellogg's, Campbell Soup, and Mars. Apparel companies VF Corporation, Nike, and Levi's, and other corporate heavyweights like Monsanto, DuPont, Intel, and Johnson & Johnson. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter the Business Backs Low Carbon USA letter into the record at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
And I sure hope President-elect Trump will heed this call from the leaders of the business community. Closing word, Secretary of State Kerry, in addition to providing great leadership through this, he has also started doing something that I know is precious to him and that is important to me and many of our colleagues, and that is to give oceans the global attention that they deserve. In September, more than 90 countries convened here in Washington for the Our Ocean Conference. Nations, nonprofit organizations, foundations, big corporations all came together, pledging over $5 billion for marine conservation and committing to protect more than 1.5 million square miles of ocean. Secretary Kerry secured the legacy of this Our Oceans Conference by locking in hosts for the conference for the next 3 years. Mr. President, 2016 was a year of worsening climate effects, but also of heartening climate action. The dramatic changes taking place in the Earth's climate are now undeniable. But so is the growing spirit of action among men and women of good conscience across the United States and around the world. One can hope that 2017 will be the year when we in this chamber finally wake up. I yield the floor.